Morning, everybody. I'll give you all a second to find a seat. Everyone, we still have some available. Please make yourselves comfortable. I'm excited to see everyone's already communicating. This is great. And lots of morning coffee, obviously. So welcome. This is to the 5th Annual Economic Leadership Day here in the Marshall Center. First thing I need to do is thank everyone involved in organizing today's event, the Economic Leadership Day Committee, chaired by the august soon-to-be Ambassador Bill Hite, with participation from EB, ENR, OES, Office of the Chief Economist, working together, communicating as a team, coming up with a really good program for today, and I know you're all excited. Economic Leadership Day was started a few years back with the intention of highlighting the importance of our work in the economic sphere. It's clearly a very important agenda, and we'll be hearing more from both our special guest, Karan Bhatia, Undersecretary Novelli, and the Secretary later this morning about that. But let's remember that Economic Leadership Day is not just one day of the year, but every day is Economic Leadership Day, right? You like that? Okay, I tried. But it's true because, you know, we're all economic leaders and we live day to day, and every day is a chance to exhibit the leadership that we're looking for. But the event today is really aimed at taking stock a little bit about what we do, thinking about it a little more systematically, a little more carefully, thinking about ways that we can do things together as an extended economic policy family on behalf of the United States of America. So I think it's a useful event, an important event. One thing I've often thought is that the working in the State Department is like going every day to the world's most interesting adult education class. It's like community college because you get to learn something every day. And Economic Leadership Day in the past, it's often focused on strengthening particular expertise. And today, the theme of the day, as highlighted already, is communicate. And really to think, explore how can we network, how can we communicate with one another, with the public, across bureaus, across agencies, with the private sector, and really gain deeper understanding of economic issues, energy issues, environment issues, and really do profound work on behalf of the U.S. taxpayer. And the discussion, some of the discussion later this morning will be about tools, things like information technology, but a lot of the discussion will also be about psychology and attitudes and teamwork and thinking about how we can all work together. So I will shut up. We have an exciting lineup this morning. In a moment, you'll be introduced to Karan Bhatia, one of the real leading lights of U.S. Foreign economic policy, now in the private sector, but did a superb job with USTR, including concluding our most significant free trade agreement to date with Korea. Also, you'll be hearing from the Secretary, who will be talking about, as you all know, his core philosophy: economics is foreign policy is economics, is economic policy. There's other interesting things. There's going to be some Ignite presentations. I'll be ignited by those. There's going to be a parable. It's starting to sound a little bit like church. A parable about the importance of horizontal communication in a vertical organization. Presentations on energy at state, econ at state, and the like. And then towards the end of the day, happy hour. Because what better way to communicate than by showing how happy we are to be with each other through happy hour. So I'm going to turn it over to Robin, who's going to introduce, Robin Dunnigan from ENR, who's going to introduce our featured guest speaker. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you look forward to it. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to thank all of the econ officers who are here today because really, without all of you, the people in this room, we could not advance U.S. commercial and economic interests overseas. And really, I think most of us here spent considerable time advocating for U.S. companies. And really, for me, it's one of my favorite parts of the job because without, I think that given a level playing field, I would put U.S. companies against any competitor on the planet. American companies bring the best technology, expertise, and corporate citizenship wherever they operate around the world. And General Electric is clearly one of those companies. GE technology and equipment enable local populations to access modern electricity. Its ability to manage risk and invest in emerging markets help grow those economies. And its local partnerships create jobs. I mean, jobs that offer families all around the world, from the United States to Vietnam, where GE has operations, a real chance at economic prosperity. One of our missions in the Energy Bureau is to help make energy markets more sustainable and more resilient. We try to expand local populations' access to electricity. We work to increase the use of cleaner technologies. We can't achieve any of those goals without the technology and expertise of companies like GE. GE also displays the exemplary, I would say, corporate citizenship. Last year, GE Tunisia and GE South Africa were both finalists for the Secretary's Award for Corporate Excellence and Social Responsibility. So clearly a great company, and I think great, smart, innovative companies like GE typically have leadership that reflect those same attributes. And that's certainly true in the case of our keynote speaker today, Karan Bhatia. As Vice President and Senior Counsel of Global Government Affairs and Policy, Karan oversees GE's engagement on commercial and public policy issues with governments around the world, working to expand GE's global presence. He brings a wealth of experience to his current job. I think Kurt mentioned a few of those things, and you have a bio in your program today, but it's really quite incredible. Karan served as Deputy U.S. Trade Representative, Assistant Secretary for Aviation and International Affairs at the Department of Transportation, Deputy Undersecretary and Chief Counsel at the Department of Commerce. He's also served on the boards of OPIC and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. He has an impressive educational background with degrees from Princeton, a master's degree from the London School of Economics, a law degree from Columbia. So he clearly brings a wealth of private and public sector experience to his current job. But a few weeks ago, I got even more insight into Karan's leadership at his company. We all know that our local employees are really the backbone and the brains and the heart of our missions overseas. I had the pleasure of working with one of the best local employees I've ever worked with, Aisham Sargan, who was covered trade and energy for us at our embassy in Ankara for many years. I had lunch with her a few weeks ago and found out that Karan has actually hired her away, and she's now on his senior global affairs team in Turkey. So clearly, here's a leader who recognizes and knows how to develop and get great talent. It's our loss, but she couldn't have gone to a better company. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our keynote speaker today, Karan Bhatia.
Thank you so much, Robin and Kurt and Kathy, for that introduction. Hiring former State Department people has become really one of my stock in trades. I do it with reckless abandon, so I should probably start by apologizing. But actually, what I wanted to do was start by thanking you all. I'm honestly tremendously honored to be here today, not just because I have never been the warm-up act for the Secretary of State before, but more broadly because this team, the State Department writ large, but the economic officers in particular, have been such fabulous partners for General Electric for many, many years, and certainly in my time there, you will become, in many cases, as expert in our issues and our products as our sales team is itself on the ground, and we are truly grateful for the amount of time and effort that you put in, not just on behalf of GE, but on behalf of all the American companies that are seeking to be actively engaged around the world. I have to say that when I mentioned to my sales colleagues that I was coming to see you today, they actually, rather than speak about the subject that I'm going to end up speaking about, wanted me to do a 20-minute tutorial on our newest products and pass out a stack of promotional brochures. I, of course, refused to do that, and wily sales team. So, in any event, let me move forward and actually share with you some thoughts on a couple of subjects. The theme, as I had understood it for today's session with you all was communications and indeed how we at GE have communicated and have undertaken institutional change. And that's a subject that I've become very familiar with in my course of my 7 years at GE. I have to tell you that having spent time in both the public and private sectors, there are a lot of similarities between the two, more than, in fact, most would probably want to admit, maybe on either side. But one of the differences, one of the biggest differences that I've seen is the appetite for change that exists in the corporate world, and particularly at GE. 130-year-old company, you would expect it to be fairly set in its ways. I have to tell you, one of the things that's amazed me is how dramatically it's changed even in the 7 years that I've been there, and how much the appetite for change exists. So whether you're talking about the array of our businesses, I put up there what exists today. But when I joined, it was a very different set of businesses, and the balance that existed between the industrial businesses, basically the seven that are shown down here, and GE Capital, which is our financial services business, was far different. GE Capital was about 50-55% of GE as a whole. In the interim, the last 6 years, it's become closer to 30% and is becoming even smaller. So that's one change that's significant. But the other, and the one that I'm going to spend more time on today, is the degree to which GE has become global and how we've become global. Now, the idea that GE is not a global company may surprise many of you. You've seen us operating probably in many of the countries around the world where you work. But the reality is that 7 years ago when I joined the company, we were a much less global company than we are today. 60% of our revenues were derived in the United States. Today, 40% of our revenues are derived in the United States, 60% derived globally. That number is increasing. Within a year or two, it's probably going to be 70, 75%, perhaps even more. So we have seen a dramatic change in our company, and which leads me to sort of two points that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on today. The first is how. How has GE changed to become a more global company? And the second is, as we look around the globe today, what are we seeing and how do we anticipate changing further? And throughout all of this, I'm going to try and weave in how are we communicating about the changes that we've undertaken and the changes that we see happening going forward. So first question of how did we change, before I get into how, let me just spend a moment on why did we change. So in part, GE's recognition that we needed to become a much more globally focused company, I think, was based on the shift in the portfolio, the product portfolio that I talked to you about. When we were a financial services company, our natural markets tended to be more the developed economies. As we moved into infrastructure, back into our historical roots as a manufacturing company, we naturally shifted to the rest of the world, and in particular to the emerging markets, because that simply was where the demand was going to be for the kinds of products that we were making. But it was also, I would say, a product of what was happening in the global financial markets at the time, and the global markets writ large, where we saw, after the financial crisis, global markets continuing to grow, the developed markets slowing down substantially, and we simply needed to be able to capture that global growth to be able to sustain our employment here at home. So this is, a slide that just very quickly shows you over the past 5 years or so what our growth rates have looked like globally, and you'll see double-digit growth rates in most of the regions around the world. So that's the why did we change. The how did we change, I think, probably comes down to 6 things. The first is really leadership and vision. The message came from on high in our company, from my boss, our chairman, Jeff Immelt, from the whole management team, including a lot of what we call our P&Ls, our specific businesses, that historically have been very powerful individual entities that the old model of global engagement, the model where you had salespeople based in developed markets, mostly the United States, flying around the world, selling product, taking the revenues back to the United States and being done with it, that model, if it ever worked, certainly wasn't going to be working going forward. That if we were going to be successful abroad, we needed to be local. We needed to have local capabilities. We needed to be locally invested. We needed to be working to support local goals, local aspirations. We recognized that being local would bring speed, it would bring customer connectivity, it would bring a variety of the things that we felt we needed to be connected. So there was a relentless message from the top of the company down that that was a change we were going to make, and whether it was internal gatherings, we do a variety of these kinds of things, but with thousands of people, to the messaging that appears on your computer screen when you turn on your computer every day, was hammering in the be global, be local theme. And it is, I would say, was a significant challenge, because that was not the mentality of our businesses, and it was not the way we were organized. The organization change was probably the second big thing I would point to. We fundamentally reorganized the company in about 2008 to be able to create an institution that we internally called Global Growth and Operations that drove that change, that was a globally based organization divided into 13 regions around the world, put into place strong leaders, sometimes taken from other parts of the business who had a lot of credibility, to be able to be our local eyes, ears, to be able to cross over the multiple lines of business and be able to represent GE as a single entity into these regions. It also, frankly, played a very powerful role in driving internal change within our own company, helping be an advocate for the local markets around the world when it came to the allocation of resources or when it came to how we were communicating our presence there. So, you know, the power of leadership, number one, but organizational change, I think, has to be a key factor in driving institutional change. The remaining factors that I think have led to and been part of our global growth really captured on this slide. I think the first gets to the question of people. We have been, probably people and presence combined together, we have looked consciously to grow our presence in local markets, whether it's by hiring great people like Isham, as Robin was mentioning, around the globe, or whether it's by simply how we've chosen to promote and create, you know, career paths for people outside the developed markets. And, you know, I'll give you one example here of a specific function, my function, the government affairs and policy function, and how we've, in the past 5 or 6 years, seen this. So this was what our team looked like in 2008. We had 7 people dedicated. Now, remember, this is just one specific function. This is government affairs. We have comparable functions, HR and finance and all of that. Today, we're up to, right now, about 80 people in 33 countries around the world. So just to give you a feel, within the course of 6 years, we've dramatically scaled out globally. Now, multiply that on across many functions, and you'll get a feel for sort of the people-led element of this change. Communications and partnerships, I think, is probably the second feature of how we've done this. I mean, we consider partnerships with particularly the governments, but also with, you know, other key local players, to be a critical part of how we go in and approach these markets. We see ourselves only going to be successful if we align with local needs. And so this is an example of a chart for 2015 that we've been using about how do we align ourselves with the needs of a particular market, in this case, China. So if you think about China's focus on clean energy, on affordable health care, on things being made in China, and on China itself going global, the question is, how does GE work with each of these themes and indeed drive ourselves forward? So this is very much informing our internal strategic thinking, but it's also informing our messaging and our positioning of how do we align effectively locally. Look, at the end of the day, we understand what we are. We are a U.S.-headquartered, iconic American company, but we're seeking to be successful in a world where every country is seeking to achieve its local goals, its local aims. And for us to be successful in exporting into these markets, we're going to have to be able to position ourselves along these sorts of lines. So people and presence, partnerships and communications, and the last is really process and speed. I think one of the things that we found as we were trying to go global was that we were a much slower company than many of our competitors around the world. We weren't nimble. We weren't effective in being able to respond to customers' needs quickly. Every decision was being flowed back into the headquarters. It was taking time, and it wasn't being made with a very effective understanding of what actually the local needs and demands were. So process and speed was a key focus. There were a lot of, as we call the metrics, put into this to measure how fast we were responding to customers, how fast decisions were being made. And there was a lot of decision-making that was actually being devolved into the regions. So big area of focus there. So that's a little bit of how we've changed. Let me now turn quickly to sort of how we're seeing the world these days and what we're seeing out there. Share a few ideas of what you're likely to hear from a company like ours and how we're planning on communicating about it going forward. The one thing I would say is the slides that I'm going to use going forward are slides that we've used recently with investors, investor community. So you'll see this is being pitched to the global audience. We think this is an appealing way to sort of describe what we're doing and seeing. So very quickly, if you look over on the left-hand side, these are some of the macro themes that we see sort of playing out around the world. So the big focus on job creation, on populism, the aging of the global population, huge concerns about the environment, transparency and anti-corruption, a growing focus around the world, what we're seeing, regulatory activism in many places around the world, urbanization, energy security, and the very bottom, oil price volatility and currency volatility. So what we're seeing, a very complicated, in fact, quite volatile global environment. Does that worry us? Actually, we think it's probably a pretty good environment for us. We think that what it's creating is a growing demand for infrastructure around the world. Everywhere we go, people want more power. They want more electricity. That volatility is, in fact, creating, we think, a surge in demand for taking care of the people in their economies. What does it, however, require from us? It requires efficient solutions. It requires that our solutions be accessible, that they be, in fact, in many cases, portable. It requires capability and capacity building. It's something that we've got to be able to bring into these markets. And it requires adding local value, which is what is a key part of our focus. And lastly, it requires, we think, increasingly financing. Financing is one of the biggest challenges that we face around the world as we seek to more actively engage. There's no shortage of interest in our products, but what we do see is a challenge often in finding ways to pay for it. Just a second on that point specifically. This is, for those of you who are thinking big pictures thoughts, people in policy planning or whatever, you know, if we look forward 15 years to 2030, one of the things that worries us most is what we see in terms of an infrastructure gap, a financing infrastructure gap. This chart's from McKinsey, but there are a lot of others out there. The bottom line is if you look at the existing stock of infrastructure, you're probably talking about $30 trillion of infrastructure. Fast forward, maybe you get another 30, 35 out of governments, maybe about 13 from private investment. You still have a huge delta there of about $13 to $24 trillion. Some other time we can come back and talk about this more, but I do think that this question of how are we going to finance infrastructure globally is a cross-cutting challenge, and in fact, it's one of the things that's probably informed some of the attention that's been paid recently to new infrastructure investment institutions. So from a GE perspective, what do we see in terms of global growth? Well, look, the growth is happening. The question is, what is it that we need to do to be effective in those markets? And you know, along the right-hand side, you see five what we see as being key imperatives to GE's global growth. The first is continuing to accelerate in growth markets. You know, there is, I know, a fair amount of uncertainty about what is the durability of growth in the emerging markets. Look, yes, we are seeing tougher times in the emerging markets today than we did a year or two ago. Does that dissuade us from continuing to be heavily invested there? No. The demographics, the fundamental economics are going to be strong, particularly for long cycle businesses like ours. So very much continue to focus in growth markets, continue to focus on key geographies, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Implementation of localization strategies continues. And just a pause on that. When we talk about localization, we are not endorsing forced localization or forced localization strategies. Those we think are very bad policy, and we're opposing those in various places around the world. But that's very different from a company deciding of its own accord that the right business strategy is to become more deeply invested locally, as I've talked about. Big growth themes on healthcare, wind, and marine, and finally expansion in new markets. So just touching on each of these very briefly, here are a couple of the key geographies that we continue to focus on. China and what we call the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey both have seen substantial double-digit growth for us going forward. Both places where we think we can fit in very well. In China's case, huge mega needs where we believe whether it's healthcare or transportation or clean energy, there's going to be great alliance with what American companies can bring. The Middle East, obviously a lot of volatility, but notwithstanding that, and as I mentioned in some cases because of that, we continue to see great strengths there. Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, we think, are places where we've had strong growth. There are challenges right now. In Latin America, we think we need to continue to build our local presence stronger. Quite frankly, it's a region of the world that we think has been under-focused on both by our company and by other American companies recently. And Africa is one of our most exciting stories out there. Really great growth potential if we can actually see ways to create solutions that are appropriate for the African economy. In terms of our localization presence, or our local presence, we're looking to continue to do what we've done in places like Pune, India, and Haiphong, Vietnam, which is create very targeted manufacturing and local capacity improvement around products that are being made largely for internal markets. In India, power and water, oil and gas, aviation and transportation. In Vietnam, wind and oil and gas products, for instance. A third thing is there are a variety of countries around the world that are smaller economies that your typical American company, frankly, I think sort of skates right over. We've found that with investment in these economies, the returns are superb. These are not places that, again, most American executives, most of the people working at GE at the mid-level management feel very comfortable in, or they have a lot of familiarity with. But again, you look at places like Kazakhstan or Oman or Bangladesh. These have been great returning markets for us, and going forward, we see another tranche of 10 or so that we're going to place the same kind of bets on. Just coming towards the end, one of the things that we have been very focused on as we pursued our partnership strategy and our communication strategy with governments is this question of what's the value of a GE job, or you might broaden that up more broadly to an American company, American headquartered multinational job, vis-a-vis other jobs that you might get. And we advance the thesis that, to be honest with you, a job is not just a job. When you get a job with a local job with a company like a General Electric, it comes with so many other things around it, around leadership training and development, around skills and capacity building, around the supplier ecosystem that you get plugged into, about the innovation ecosystem within our own company, and around, and this is a very important selling point, ethical and transparent business practices, and that yields real advantages. So we've been pushing this communications platform globally with governments, and we found it, in fact, to be quite successful. So let me just close out by giving you a quick summary of sort of how we see things going forward. Bottom line is complicated, volatile world, but solid growth continuing. Companies that are smart, I think, are doubling down on investing in global markets. And as far as what we, or frankly any, I think, big American company looking to create success abroad is focused on, got to be focused on delivering solutions that actually meet local company needs. You've got to be investing locally to build innovation and supplier ecosystems to be able to create that kind of value. Look, we're big, we're global, we have the benefit of having the U.S. market to build off of, and we've got to be able to leverage that cost and scale globally. We've got to work on training and developing leaders within our own company in more places. And lastly, again, just to reiterate, we think the advantage of what was many years perceived to be a disadvantage, having to work under the FCPA, having to work in that U.S. Legal and regulatory environment, in fact, today has become a significant advantage as we seek to look at global markets. So with that, we'll stop, and I think turn back the podium. Thank you again very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Sure.
Thanks, Karan. So I'd now like to invite Undersecretary Novelli to the stage for our interactive discussion of leadership lessons from the private and public sectors. I'm sure everyone in this room knows Undersecretary Novelli, but what you might know is that prior to her current duties, she was Vice President for Worldwide Government Affairs at Apple, where she led a multinational team responsible for Apple's federal and international and state and local government relations and public policy. And prior to that, she was an assistant U.S. trade representative for Europe and the Mediterranean. So she also has a wealth of experience to bring to this discussion. So to start the ball rolling, I'd like to ask anyone who will have a question for either of them to come to one of these, to line up now at one of these mics on either side of the room. And while you're kind of coming along and doing that, I will tee off with the first question for Undersecretary Novelli. I was struck actually by Karan's comment that a GE job is more than just a job, because I think that we have that in common, State Department, with a company like GE. I think we all feel that way about our work at State Department. So my question for Undersecretary Novelli is, with that in mind, and drawing on your background in both the public and private sector, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we foster a culture of change here at the State Department, and make sure that the work we're doing both here in Washington and overseas as economic officers is truly transformative.
Well, I think that's a very large question. But I also think that, at least for me, I approach this whole endeavor as just a great privilege. And so I ask myself every day, what can I do to make sure that every day I am driving forward to make the world a better place? Because that's why I'm here, and I assume that's why you're all here. And I think it's one of the privileges of government service. And you can't do that by just staying in your niche and kind of letting the bureaucracy and the rules and the paper writing and everything just grind on and letting the gears just turn. You have to turn the gears yourself. And that is not easy. I can say, even from my position, it's not easy. But I think that part of this is about trying to look around corners, do the kinds of things that Karan's company is doing now, and saying, okay, where are we going to be in 5 years? What do we need to do about that? And we started that a little bit at the Chief of Missions conference, asking, who are the biggest country influencers today, and in individual countries? Who are they going to be in 5 years and 15 years, and what do we need to be doing about that? And how do we make sure that we, as a country, are competitive? And does that mean we need to rethink what we're doing? Because there's lots of countries out there who are getting stronger, are rising, and don't necessarily play by the same rules we do. And that doesn't mean we have to abandon our principles, but it does mean that we need to be smarter, more aggressive, and really thinking outside the box about how we bring our assets to bear on this.
Okay. Let's take a first question, and I think, let me check this is working. Yeah, can you fix that? Doesn't seem to be working. Let's start over here.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. It was very informative. I was at Embassy Jakarta, Indonesia, when we nominated GE for the Corporate Excellence Award, and GE ultimately won that worldwide. You're welcome. One of the things that impressed us was that GE was not just implementing best practices within its own company and in training its own people, but in the supply chain as well, that all of the people feeding into GE's supply chain in country were also being trained by GE to make various types of process improvements. I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
To our thinking, sorry, thanks. It's pretty core to our thinking about how we enter into markets. And we do so for multiple reasons. I will, Clearly, there are concerns that we have in places around the world about how, labor standards, transparency standards, things like that. So there is some element of that that's informing it. But frankly, the reality is that we find that where we invest in training and working with local partners, we have much better production. We have much more durable relationships going forward. So, we believe that's sort of a critical part of it. We spend billions of dollars a year in training, including the training and raising the standards of our local partners' places. So it's very much part of what we do. And, to harken back to something I was saying before, it's one of the things that when we go and talk to local governments and talk to partners, they most value. They want the products, they want the services, but they really want their people to be trained and to feel like they're, working their way up the development ladder. And so that's one of the things we feel we can bring.
Thank you. Right here.
Hi, this question is for Karan on change. So how did you overcome resistance across all the different sectors of GE, finance, healthcare, energy, and bring that across for such a large organization?
So we figured out who opposed, and we sold those businesses. So it is hard. Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, Jeff once said to me, this is like an aircraft carrier, right? And it changes slowly, and it doesn't make sharp turns. And what you have to do is apply, an enormous sort of effort to get it to make turns that a smaller institution can actually make relatively nimbly. So I think one of the things that people sometimes think is that, well, in the corporate sector, you snap your fingers and everything changes. It's not like that. I mean, you really do have to have sort of a multi-pronged strategy along the lines of what I outlined, where you would have strong internal communications. You would marry it with structural change. You'd marry it, frankly, with change in your HR practices, in the kinds of people you're bringing in, and how you're incentivizing people. So it really does require sort of a vision, and then a sort of carefully calibrated, coordinated effort to achieve the ultimate goal, bringing each of these management tools to bear.
We can all relate to your aircraft carrier analogy. Thank you. Let's go over here.
Good morning. Thank you both for being willing to discuss these issues with us. Mr. Bhatia, and also you, Undersecretary Novelli, if there's an opportunity, I'd like to find out more about how the tools that you use to foster the internal communication that you're talking about when you're communicating across cultures, across the globe, and still maintaining the corporate principles, what have you, that you had, at the same time increasing the processing speed so that people know what they need to know in a timely fashion. Thank you.
Kathy, I know, has experience at a great company as well, who excel in communications. I'd say from our perspective, the challenge that you identify, how do you drive this across not just multiple businesses, but multiple regions and multiple cultures, is very much a challenge. I mean, when we're speaking about this change, we're speaking, to 80 countries people from 80 countries around the world. I think one of the things, again, I hate to keep harkening back to this sort of vision and communications thing, but you've got to paint a very credible picture for people of why we're doing what we're doing, why we're going to the direction we're going. And I think, explaining the world is where it is, right? The world is moving where there are growth markets that are going to be the drivers of change. So I think you're not simply going to command it without a credible explanation, but that credible explanation does tend to galvanize people across businesses and across regions. I'd say that's one. The second is and this is not my area of expertise, but we have very good internal communicators, keeping the messages simple, right? There tends to be this inclination that I certainly suffer from, I think many people who've worked in government and law sometimes do, is to have lengthy descriptions, lengthy text, and so forth. The power of a single sentence or a word in driving that sort of consciousness I've found to be really powerful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, I had this conversation with someone about the simplicity who said Twitter is a horrible thing because, you know, it doesn't allow you to do nuance. And I actually said, I think Twitter is a great thing because it forces you to get to the essence of what is really important. And I think if you can't communicate what it is you're about in that amount of time, then you don't really know what you're about. And so I would, you know, really urge people to reduce what they're doing to what is the essence, because I think if you focus on what's the essence, then you'll be able to get stuff done. And all this extraneous things kind of fall away. And this was something, you know, I really learned from Steve Jobs, who I had the privilege of working with. But Steve always said, it's not the things that I say yes to that I'm the proudest of. The most important things are the things I say no to, because I have to focus on what I do. And the other piece of this, I think, is that communicating to everybody so everybody knows what is it that we're about. And if you keep your eyes on that, I think it's a lot easier to get where you need to go, because if you're not doing something that is furthering what you've deemed to be essential, then maybe you don't need to be doing it. And I think that really can help you drive things forward and not get so distracted by all the other extraneous things that tend to crop up.
I think that's a terrific point, and I think that's something that's not emphasized in our culture at all here at State Department. Thank you. We all feel that way, yeah, okay. That was an understatement, I guess. Who's next?
Good morning. I'd like to ask if you can draw on your experience in the private sector to tell us how we as economic officers at the State Department can do a better job communicating with the private sector to explain how we're advancing our policies, what our policies are, how we are trying to advance your interests as well. And similarly, how we can do a better job explaining, communicating with the host governments that we interact with on U.S. business priorities.
So on the first question, look, there's an enormous amount of communication that actually does go on. I mean, I hear from our teams all around the world that they're in contact every week or day with economic officers out there. So I do feel that there's, at a very operational level, very good communications. And then I feel like at sort of a central level, we've got great relationships with EB and always have had. I do think maybe it harkens back to something that Kathy was talking about before, this idea, though, of a strategic sort of competitive vision for the United States in a highly competitive global economy. And what is our value proposition, and what is it that we, as a country, writ large, are bringing? So, I mean, think about, I always look back at Singapore, it's these places that have very structured, sort of clearly established visions of how they fit into the global economy, and they go out there and sell it, sell the dickens out of it. The U.S. isn't in the same position as Singapore, obviously. We're a very different kind of economy. But I still feel, I guess if there were one suggestion I'd have, I think it's having, and it probably, is almost like a marketing campaign. I think it needs sort of that kind of polish. But I do think that would be helpful. And I think that would be, frankly, helpful to both of the audiences you alluded to. I think it should be informed by the U.S. business community and input from us, but in fact would help message to the U.S. business community to the value the State Department was bringing. And then I also think it would be a very powerful tool to the globe, to foreign governments as well. But that's just a thought.
One thing to that, and I think that we have to think about who are the influencers for any given thing. And so it's going to be governments, and that's who we're used to talking with. But it's not just governments. Who influences those governments? And it may be different in every country, but I think we have to think about the layers of influencers. And it can be business, it can be NGOs, it can be scientists, it can be the press, it can be the public, it can be all those people. And I think that part of the communication, what we have to get out of our box is it's not just about sending demarches. It's about thinking about what is it that we want to drive, and making sure, like Karan said, if you have a marketing campaign, you don't just have a marketing campaign to one pinpoint. You have to think about what are those layers that you're marketing to, and what do you say to them, and what are you asking them to do? Because it's not just about talking. It's also about listening from them, and what are they telling you that's going to help reshape what you think. Because one thing that struck me when I came here is that listening to everybody, I sort of felt like people felt like they had all the answers to everything. And coming from the outside, that's not how I perceive the world at all. And there's just a ton of information out there that folks are not accessing, and I think it would very much reshape what you thought you should accomplish even. And so I think it's really important to reach out and listen, and then shape the, sort of what are we about and how are we going to react to it, and not just talk at people. So I think it's a multi-layered and multi-dimensional approach.
Okay.
Hello, good morning. So perfect question to follow up on your comments, Undersecretary. I was wondering if each of you could tell us how many data scientists are there at each of the companies that you just came from, and how many people whose job is not so much on the product side, but just in terms of using data, either to know whether or not the product is meeting the need you designed it to meet, or if it's not meeting it, then to do investigations into how to make changes. I think there's 70,000 people at the State Department. So maybe you could also mention how many people work at the companies. I can't remember. Okay,
so Apple's employees when I left, I think, were like 110,000, something like that. But I'm sure it's way more now. But interestingly, there were no data scientists at Apple. The only thing that people knew about whether a product was meeting people's needs was whether it sold or didn't sell. And there was no focus groups. There were no any of that stuff. That's just not how the way the company did business, because they felt like trying to make something by committee wasn't really going to get you anything except an ugly product. So you really just had to drive for that purity of vision. But they certainly did listen to what people would send in, comments, et cetera, and would try to make decisions about that. And the App Store actually came out of that whole thing because developers were complaining that originally there were no apps that could be put on extra. And so when the App Store started, they thought, okay, we'll let these developers do something. They thought they'd get 100 apps. When I left, there were like 5 million when I left. So I think it's important to have data. I think that is important, but I think it's also important to use your gut and to not just only think about the numbers, because sometimes the numbers don't really give you the full picture. But you may have it.
So we're about 300,000 people globally. The answer to your question would have been very different 5 years ago, or maybe even 3 years ago, than it is today. We are making a very big bet on data, big data, and hiring a lot of data scientists. We're doing it, frankly, because we see it not as necessarily a way of validating or testing the products that we've currently got out there, but rather because we think it is going to be a significant line of business to add on to our existing install base. Most people don't know this, but almost all the equipment that we manufacture on the industrial side, aircraft engines, turbines, healthcare devices, are throwing off a tremendous amount of data. And right now, only a very small fraction of that data is actually being used. And there is, if you pile that data together, it has the ability to yield enormous efficiencies. So, if you increase the efficiency of your turbine use by 1%, the value ultimately to the end consumer is enormous. And so we are spending a lot of money developing sort of services products, really, that sit alongside the hardware to enable the customers to get the benefit of that. So our data science, so we are hiring a lot of data scientists. If any of you have kids who are aspiring to be data scientists, or if you want to be data scientists, let me know. But we're hiring a lot of data scientists. But I think your question gets to something else, which is to what extent we're using that capability to actually validate some things that might be outside of simply the product, including our messaging, our brand. We do a lot of analysis of that. I mean, we, like Apple, have a lot at stake in the value of our brand. So we do a lot of testing. We do a lot of analysis of that. We don't, frankly, do a lot of that internally by bringing in data scientists, but we have a lot of people out there who are measuring, day by day, market by market, sort of how that is being treated.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, so I have a question about SMEs, referring to small, medium-sized enterprises as opposed to subject matter experts. The question I have, it's been vexing me for a while, which is how do you make sure that you have engaged with a very large number of very small actors, not just with regard to advocacy for them overseas, but actually making sure that policy discussions reflect their needs and prerogatives. And it's a resource problem that seems to me to be somewhat unsolvable. I mean, the first thing you learn about SMEs is they typically don't have a global government affairs person of this kind of caliber. So you're not getting position papers, and they don't know how to find you. You have to go out and find them. So, then you can find various collection points where there's SME expertise, one of which is the Small Business Administration, and we actually met with the administrator, Maria Contreras-Sweet, a couple of months ago. She's actually really interested in engaging internationally. But even they have resource limitations, particularly with regard to international work. And so if we don't have those resources either, how do you overcome the resource barrier of engaging with these folks? And in particular, there's high-tech startups who I think have an awful lot to say about tech policy discussions, about issues like net neutrality, about issues like privacy, regulation. But you have to go to them. They can't come to you. Thank you.
I don't know if this is that's wrong with. Well, interestingly, everywhere I travel, I always try to meet members of the tech community and entrepreneurs, and I will say that one of the things that's striking about it is the remarkable similarity among these people. You could put them all in a room, and if you didn't know what their nationality was, you wouldn't know what their nationality is, which I think is fascinating. One of the things that tech entrepreneurs share is this very libertarian kind of viewpoint, which is just leave me alone, let me create my thing. The government is usually not seen as an asset, but rather as something that's going to get in the way. And that's pretty much true every single place. Even in China, when I met the tech entrepreneurs there, I was so struck by that. In fact, I asked them, well, do you have any questions for me? And they all looked at me very suspiciously and said, why do you want to meet us? But I agree with you. I think it is hard to reach out, and it's sort of like, the difference of wholesale or retail, right? I mean, you've got all these little companies, and how do you get to them? I do think the web is a good way. I mean, I think that reaches a lot of people, and a lot of small and medium businesses are pretty web savvy because they have to be for their businesses. So I think that's one way, and I think you have to think creatively about how to hook them into that. But I also think that you're right, that you sort of start with these little nodules of folks and then try to build from that. And that's something I hope embassies are doing, but also the Commerce Department is doing, as well as the Small Business Administration. And I think you've got to, each small business is going to have different issues. But making it easier for them to access their customers is probably the biggest one, because they don't have whole bevies of government affairs people to figure out, what do they do. And also, I think finding ways to make accessible to them what are the rules for doing business in different countries, because that's the other thing that they don't know what those are. And so I think that some of this is about how do we push information out to them as well as take in from them.
So I think this SME issue is a really important one, and I say that as one of, representing one of the biggest companies in the world. But what we've clearly come to appreciate, not that it required it's not rocket science, but we are no way near as popular as your average SME, right? Anywhere around the world, politicians would much rather meet with an SME than with GE. I mean, we may be the ones that ultimately are going to solve their power problems, but we don't make for a very good photo op. So I think that you're right. From our perspective, as we look at it, there's sort of two challenges here. It's sort of U.S. SMEs and then SMEs globally. And we don't think fundamentally our goals on policy issues differ that much. The reality is that what we want, good, transparent governance, sound regulatory policy, predictable institutions, those are important for us, and we think they're very important for SMEs as well. So there may be a few areas where they would see more focused on certain things than we, but we think in general we're in the same place. The question is, the SMEs are exactly right. They don't have the resources, they don't have the wherewithal, and they don't, really think in terms of engaging in Washington. So, one thing is, how do we as larger companies, SMEs we are an aggregation of SMEs, right? We are a lot of suppliers and providers and partners all over the world who are a lot of SMEs. So part of it falls on us, and we are working very hard to try and engage our SMEs on policy issues, and frankly would look to partner with you on that in the United States and we have been doing this on issues like trade and reauthorization of the U.S. Export-Import Bank and things like that. I think the other point is globally, SMEs abroad, if the U.S. could, the private sector and public sector working together, really take on the challenge of how do we help empower local SMEs, I think that could be a huge positive for the United States writ large. If we are seen as being an enabler of local SMEs accessing the global markets, and again, that's done through larger companies like us, but it's also done by helping them raise their standards, whether it's their production standards or their transparency standards and so forth. So I think this is an area, I don't have a great answer for you, but I do think you've put your finger on a very important thing, and I think ultimately this is going to have to be something where the U.S. government, I think, works with large private sector entities to try and take that on.
Folks, the Secretary should be here in a couple of minutes, so we could perhaps take one more question. I don't know how far we'll get, but let's, with that in mind.
It's a short question, don't worry.
Very good.
We all know the Secretary is very interested in us engaging the private sector overseas, and for most econ officers, that is not the problem. Enthusiasm is not the issue. It's more on the other side. Where's the line where we stop sort of engaging and maintain the autonomy of the U.S. government? I think that's where some, especially at the junior officer level, we have trouble stopping. So I'd like to hear, given the vast experience you guys have on both sides of the issue, and particularly in multinational companies where, we advocate for something and then we find out it was made in Korea. Could you guys say something about that?
You want me? So just so I understand, the concern is that you're engaging too much with the local companies are pushing you to advocate for things.
Well, no, we're enthusiastic. Don't get me wrong.
Okay.
As econ officers, we want to engage. The point is, where do we stop engaging and say we're still the United States government? We have to stop here.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, look, I think, yeah, your job is not to be out there advocating for Korean products or anybody else's. That they have very capable governments who are advocating and supporting their products globally. I have never been one to believe that, the U.S., for instance, should abandon content requirements around advocacy, for instance. I know that's sometimes an issue. Now, the reality is that I think having 100% content requirement around advocacy is not feasible. That that nobody produces anything in one country. But I do think that there is a value. There is a role for the U.S. government. You're being paid by the U.S. taxpayers to advocate for policies and transactions and so forth that end up benefiting the United States. So I don't have any particular concern about that. I have not seen, from my vantage point, I haven't seen this to be a major issue. We try to sort of self-govern on something like this as well. If we are selling a product that doesn't have a lot of U.S. connection, I don't want the Secretary out. That's embarrassing at the end of the day for you guys and for us to have him advocate, and we would seek other support in that kind of situation. But So I think you've got certainly it's a legitimate point. I'm hoping we're not putting you in awkward positions around this, but if we are, let me know. So.
I mean, I think you're right that you have to always keep in mind that you're the U.S. government, and so obviously you're not going to do things like negotiate people's contracts for them. I mean, I think I would draw the line there. But you would be surprised. I mean, there's lots of people who come and ask us to do that. So I do think that I think you're right, you do have to draw lines, but I also think it's sometimes situational. So it's hard to say it's this and not that. But I agree with Karan that part of what it needs to be about is, are you supporting companies that are creating jobs in the U.S.? Because as representatives of the U.S., that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Let's take one more question over here.
So I guess really what I want to do is get your insight on what it means for corporations like yours to be going increasingly global. So, you know, you describe yourself as multinational and you talk about global and local. What does that mean for your American identity, or what does that mean for your relationship to America, right? Beyond just being headquartered here, because that's easily changed.
Absolutely. So look, the voyage that I've described, right, is one that's taking us from a situation where, 80% of our people based in the United States to probably one where 70%, so I don't have the exact numbers, but, and similarly on content, we are overwhelmingly, the value of what we're producing is coming out of the United States. I don't see the challenge for American companies ultimately as being that we're abandoning the U.S. market. I really don't. I think, this is where all of our businesses, or almost all, we've got one based abroad, but most of our businesses are headquartered, most of our employees are, most of our manufacturing continues to be here, most of our innovative work continues to happen here. The U.S. is always going to be, as long as we remain a competitive economy, which, we need to do things to improve, we need to invest in our innovation, we need to invest in our human resources and so forth. But as long as we as a country to continue to do that, I have no ultimate worries about American companies being strong here. What I worry more about is these incredible growth markets around the world where we're seeing competitors from existing, standing Europe, Japan, et cetera, but also new countries deeply penetrating, working very hard, often in concerts with their governments, and American companies being a little bit more reluctant, a little bit more risk averse, a little bit more concerned about, well, do I take that additional step? So I am actively supportive of companies, ours and others, investing more in these markets because that's what you've got to do to get in. Once you're in, believe me, it's going to support jobs and innovation and growth in both places. We see that every day. Big deal in Egypt, it's going to end up supporting gas turbines coming out of Greenville as well as local jobs in Egypt. I mean, the great thing that I've found about and I'll stop, but from moving from where I was before in the U.S. government, where I was sort of advocating for trade in this ethereal sense, to where I am now is I actually see it, right? I see that when we do a sale, when we get an investment, when we put in a job, it is genuinely creating jobs in both places. It's creating value in both places. So, we talk about TPA and TPP and these things in the abstract. Believe me, when you're out there, it's actually working, and it's doing good for both sides.
I would just add, I think it goes to, Apple went through a similar transformation when I was there during my 7 years there, where when I started there, more than 50% of the revenue came from the U.S., and when I left, probably 70% came from outside the U.S., and that means but it doesn't mean you're not an American company. And I think it goes back to leadership as well and vision, and where does that come from? And just because you're far-flung in terms of Apple had a lot of retail stores, you can't do that from the U.S., obviously. You have to hire locally. Oops. So I am very, very privileged, honored to welcome Secretary Kerry to our 5th Annual Economic Leadership Day. We know the Secretary is somebody who has boundless energy, courage, conviction, and leads by example, by doing, and is always pushing us to innovate and advance our economic, commercial, energy, and environmental interests. Mr. Secretary, you can see by all the people that are here that it's proof of your leadership that economic policy is foreign policy and foreign policy is economic policy. And so I'd like, without further ado, to welcome you to the podium so that we can hear about your vision. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Kathy, thank you very much. Thanks all for being here. Good morning to you, and welcome to this important discussion. And Kathy, thank you for your spectacular leadership, together with the rest of Ambassador Thorne, others, Charlie Rifkin, Ambassador Rifkin, others who've been tackling this effort to try to intensify our own commitment to the integration of economic choices, economic policy, as a very, very clear component, in fact, a leading component of the agenda with respect to foreign policy. And I'm particularly grateful to all the other members of the team, Scott Nathan, Chief Economist Ledema, and Special Envoy Hochstein, who's been doing some terrific work really implementing this in important parts of the world where this makes an enormous difference to security. Energy choices obviously translate into security as well as jobs. So I thank everybody, Foreign Service, Civil Service, locally engaged staff, all those and beyond, for embracing this concept. And, you know, I don't want to praise you too much because I want to exhort you to do more. And that's the point of today, is really to convince everybody that there is a lot more that we can really do. Whether you call it economic statecraft or shared prosperity or economic diplomacy, which is a term that I sort of prefer, frankly, I think that this is a way of standing up for American workers, increasing jobs here at home, providing for, you know, a shared set of possibilities, shared prosperity, as Ambassador Thorne so often refers to it as, which is a critical vision that embraces what we're trying to do, is lift people up everywhere and see that the fruits of free trade agreements, a compact which, by the way, has become somewhat frayed because of the lack of an adequate sense of the shared prosperity, that it sort of goes to the top, or it goes to few, or it goes to the external corporate entity and not down the food chain enough to the people who are really, you know, doing the labor and providing the capacity of those businesses to do business. So I would tell you that, you know, as both a senator, 29 years on the Foreign Relations Committee, and now as Secretary of State, I'm privileged to travel, and have been privileged to travel to an awful lot of places, and some of them are quite exotic. I can report to you with great confidence, as a result of all these travels, that I've discovered that everywhere people like to eat. You may think that's a big conclusion, but I'm telling you, whether it's, you know, having shoes that are resistant to the cold or the water, or having clothes to be able to wear, or a roof over your head and adequate shelter, everybody everywhere has a pretty basic set of fundamental needs that translates into aspirations. And around those needs, usually some kind of politics organizes itself. And you know, increasingly, people in China, for instance, are creating an environmental imperative in terms of politics of China, because they want air that's clean, and they want rivers that aren't polluted, and so forth. And that's true in many, many other places in the world. People want the dignity that comes from being recognized for their skills, and also for what they do, for the role that they get to play in life, for their ability to have the dignity of providing for their family, being able to work. That's how this translates into foreign policy. And there is nothing theoretical or abstract about what we're talking about here in terms of economic policy. We are really addressing very basic human needs. And in doing so, we are speaking to a universal set of hopes and values that defines the politics of every nation. It's interesting, when you analyze the surveys of the last 50 years, almost every survey shows that when our citizens are asked what matters to them most in terms of foreign policy, two things top the list. First, questions of war and peace. So almost no-brainer, but the second is jobs and trade. That's what people think about when they think about foreign policy. And everything else is far behind, folks. So that's why I have said many, many times, and you will hear me say it many, many more times, that foreign and economic policy are really one and the same. If you don't have a good economic policy, you're not going to have a good foreign policy. And vice versa, obviously. Kind of goes together, like Fenway Park and the Green Monster, folks, for those of you who understand those analogies. You can't have one without the other. It's that simple. So I'm not here this morning to try to open eyes or light a fire, because the eyes are open and the fire is lit. What I want to do is turn up the heat a little bit, if we can, and see if we can't, over these next, months, year and a half, plus a little bit more now, keep cranking so that this gets somewhat institutionalized, if possible. And I intend to speak out on this a little more. I'm going to be, I hope to give what certainly from my point of view I would consider an important speech regarding our trade agenda somewhere in the next couple of months, including the case for Trade Promotion Authority. And obviously I think this is going to be a major focus on Capitol Hill over the course of the next few months. TPA is critical to being able to nail down the TPP, and that may be critical to being able to nail down the TTIP. And I'm sorry for all of the T's and P's and so forth. I didn't create it. But, if we're going to succeed in taking 40% of global GDP in the Pacific arena, and then 40% when you combine Europe and the United States, it's going to be critical that we're able to pass this. And able to pass it, we're going to be able to get the TPA. I think we can. I don't think this is mission impossible at all. But we need to raise public consciousness about it. We need to get people to tune into what it's all about. And the fact is that this is not only important to us in the context of our interests that are directly related to creating jobs and growing our own economy, those jobs in Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa or very many other places, the heartland of America that people don't always think about, which are directly related to exports and directly related to global sales. And since 95% of the world's population lives everywhere else, you're not going to survive just selling to yourself. You've got to be in that market, and we've learned that lesson by now. But it's also important in terms of our values, raising international labor standards, raising consciousness about environmental standards, and being able to have trade rules that get rid of the barriers, the non-tariff trade barriers, the other things that stand in the way of our ability to be able to compete fairly. So these ambitious agreements that I've just mentioned are more than capable of making our economy both bigger and better at the same time. And I want to emphasize that terms such as integration or reference to an agreement's size does not mean a lot to that factory worker in Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa that I just mentioned about. It doesn't mean a lot to a dairy farmer up in Vermont. unless we frame our argument with very down-to-earth examples about jobs, income, living standards that people can really relate to and understand. To simplify this discussion. And certainly you don't have to be an economics major to understand, or work here at the State Department, ultimately to understand the connection and the importance of this. Ultimately, it's my hope that as people begin to see this connection, it can actually translate into greater support from Congress for some of the things that we try to do. Because when people get the connection to the jobs here at home, as well as to the standards being raised elsewhere and the economic opportunities elsewhere, you know, it's an easier sell to get them to buy into the policy components of it at the same time. So the department is going to continue to try to make it a priority to highlight fair treatment for American companies and responsible foreign investment here in the United States. And I think this is some of the most important work that we do, frankly, and I don't think it happens by accident. It happens because we have a team that's dedicated to making it happen. And it takes a ton of personal diplomacy. It is a constant process of sharing information to persuade people so they can grab onto the idea and sell it in their own countries. And it requires also a kind of good feel, ultimately, a sense of when the deal can be closed and how the deal can be closed. I'm talking about the particular partnership or the particular business opportunity. And everybody's got to kind of develop a sense of that, frankly. A couple of weeks ago at the Select USA Summit here in Washington, which we do jointly, as all of you know, with the Commerce Department, I was really impressed to see dozens, literally. I think we had about 50 ambassadors there, coincided with the Chief of Mission Conference, and not by accident. But all of our ambassadors were there, and they were helping teams of investors to understand why there's a virtue to putting their money here in America and investing here, and how we could also marry those companies to jobs back in their home, in their country, and create a huge synergy between this kind of proactive outreach that helps people understand. A lot of people don't know how to invest or don't know what the rules are going to be or how it benefits them or all of these kinds of things. We need to be proactively out there advocating for it. So I want to thank everybody here who may have helped to make Select USA a success. Third thing I want to mention is that we rely on our economic experts, frankly, to help advance vital political and security objectives. And a dramatic example is taking place right now in connection to the Iran negotiation, for instance. The sanctions architecture that many of you helped create is what brought Iran to the table, economic policy. And going forward, we're going to strive to ensure that there is the right match between sanctions relief and the implementation of Iran's commitments. So it's no secret, obviously, that you know, the sanctions historically were a pretty blunt instrument. But with more precise targeting and with stronger enforcement, and this has been, frankly, very true of what we've been able to do in Ukraine, with respect to Europe and the European component of those sanctions, because we didn't want those countries crushed by what we were doing, so we needed to target in very specific ways. It's been very sophisticated, frankly, and it's also been pretty successful at minimizing the negative impact on the countries that are undertaking them and maximizing the impact where we needed to do so. So we're doing a better job. We're getting better at this all the time. And it matters how we choose to apply these things, whether you're easing restrictions or whether you're threatening to sharpen them, as we have been, particularly in the case of Ukraine. So the more effective that sanctions are, the more versatile our national security toolbox will be. And that's another example. Fourth, we are making the case for energy transformation, as all of you know. And particularly the case for the transformation to clean and renewable energy sources. Many of you have heard me talk previously about how this is the mother of all markets. It really is. You know, I've said many times the market that made a lot of people rich in America and saw every quintile of American taxpayer go up in their income in the 1990s was a $1 trillion market with 1 billion users, 1 for 1. The energy market that we're looking at today is a $6 trillion market with 4 to 5 billion users today, and it's going to go up to 9 billion users. Think of what that means. If we can begin to get these alternative and new renewable energy sources out, if you can begin to bring, a solar-driven pump for water to an African village, if you can begin to transform people's dependency on, away from where they don't have carbon sequestration capacity, away from coal and onto a cleaner source. I mean, these are huge combined policies that have a profound impact on the quality of life, not to mention the survivability of the planet itself. So that's a policy. And it's driven to a large measure by economic choices. So we see this right now in President Obama's Power Africa initiative, the Caribbean Energy Initiative, Connecting Americas initiative, and a new regional clean energy finance facility that we expect the President to unveil this very weekend when we're down in Panama. So our commitment to this is becoming more and more visible, more and more tangible, more and more understandable to everybody. And as we try to promote the diversification of fuel sources, of supply routes, of energy providers in Europe, we're not just making LNG available to people at a lower price or something. We're actually reducing the dependency of many countries on a one source of power, where blackmail or other, rationales of policy can wind up having a profoundly negative impact on those countries. I was just in Bulgaria recently, where the South Stream pipeline, as you all know, got canceled, and they have a profound set of complicated choices to make. Europe and the United States have committed to a major effort at our U.S.-EU Energy Summit this year to try to move many of these countries to a greater level of independence, and that will have profound policy implications. But it's going to take good economic policy to make all of this happen. So our goal is to capitalize in a way on all of this connection, interconnectedness, that creates millions of new jobs, lowers long-term costs, improves the quality of the air we breathe, lowers the emission of greenhouse gases that cause climate change, and provides greater day-to-day security for people in country after country. And our message is that the right energy policy is also the right climate policy, because the solution to climate change is energy policy. I think when you also look at what we do in terms of disaster response, our Stabilization Bureau, our interventions in terms of spread of disease and other kinds of things, all of those things become more complicated depending on the choices that we make with respect to the supply of energy and the quality of people's air and life where they live. And so the potential of climate refugees is a very real challenge that people need to stop and think about over the course of the next 15, 20, 30 years. You could have mass migrations as a consequence of what is happening in places. Absence of food, absence of water, spread of disease. So this is linked, believe me. Make the right energy choices today, get the right economic policy in place to support those investments, to move people in those directions, and you wind up with a whole different set of choices 20 or 30 years down the road. The fifth thing, just very quickly, we have to, and I'm pretty fixated on this after many years in the Senate as chairman of the Oceans Subcommittee, and recently we had our Oceans Conference here, which Kathy and the team put together brilliantly. But we have to conserve our oceans, folks. I know when you look out there and you see this massive body of water combined, all connected, by the way, It's imposing, and you think nothing could ever change it, but it is changing very rapidly every single day. There's still people who, despite our ban of drift net fishing 10, 15 years ago, there's still people who engage in drift net fishing illegally. And they strip mine the ocean, and they throw half the catch away, bycatch it's called. They just throw it away. Our ocean conference last spring raised awareness. We're taking on illegal fishing. We're taking on the false labeling of seafood, and we're designating the world's largest no-catch marine protected area, thanks to President Obama's initiative. We're also pushing hard to bring countries together to reduce the amount of pollutants and other junk that finds its way into our ocean waters. A recent article in Science magazine predicted that unless we do something quickly, by 2025, there will be 1 ton of garbage in the ocean for every 3 tons of fish. My friends, that literally would be a felony against the future. Finally, economic policy is an integral part of our approach to post-conflict reconstruction in the fight against violent extremism. It's definitely the case that factors such as ideology, religion, nationalism, tribal identity are going to play a critical role in igniting conflict. But the damage that those passions cause is magnified many times over when demagogues are able to exploit the frustration, the unemployment, and the despair of surrounding populations. So whether we're talking about a disrespected fruit peddler in Tunisia, or a discharged military man in Iraq, or an orphan teenager in Syria, or a guy with a PhD but no job in Egypt, the better the options a person has, the less likely bad choices will be made. And helping to create those better alternatives is a primary task of our generation, and it's one about which I invite not only your daily efforts, every single one of you, but your biggest and your boldest ideas. Nobody's cornered the market on how to diminish this pool of violent extremists. And we've all been told that the meek shall inherit the earth, and I'm not going to argue with that concept. I know better than that. But I'll tell you this, nowhere is it written that the meek are going to save the earth. If you don't speak up, if you don't speak out, if you don't talk about how to raise living standards and how to change our energy culture or forge new trade agreements, we're not going to win this battle. A battle we can win if you will speak up and if you will continue to push. And if your embassy, if you're in an embassy or wherever you are, will push this agenda and help to generate or save American jobs, then you need to let us know how you think we can do that better. If you have thoughts about how to make a more persuasive public case for this economic agenda, help us to do that. If you have thoughts about how we can orchestrate new and winning connections between employees and investors, the world needs to hear from you. So we live in an era of instant gratification. If you can't find the answer on Google pretty quickly, you give up. We grow impatient. 5 minutes of input. It's just the nature of the beast. But I'll tell you, the path to shared prosperity is going to require a stick-to-itness, a stay-at-it effort that is contrary to the norm in many places. We need to really go at this, and there's going to be a fair amount of turbulence in a lot of different places over the course of these next years as more and more populations demand more faster. As a world that is in touch with every other part of the world, every minute of every single day, wants its share of what it sees other people have. We are going to have to be ahead of this already very fast-paced, fast-moving, highly complex arena that we have all chosen to be in. I am confident that we have the people who can do it, but I want everybody to stay super focused, and if we do, I'm confident over the next year and a half, we will succeed in really establishing within this department, anyway, and I think some others, who are coming along on this, our own culture, a new culture, if you will, that is ready to literally not only help define the future, but embrace it with all of the energy and enthusiasm that we need to. So thank you for being here this morning. Thanks for being part of the team. Let's make it happen. Thank you.